We're really excited to put on this event, and it really started because I had met Ken. We were doing some work together. We are doing some work together around freight issues. And what happened is I saw Ken's resume, and I saw that he just published a new book called Asian American Workers Rising: The Struggle for. Well, I'm going to butcher the title now, but it's about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. labor movement. And I knew the name was coming up, and I thought, hey, we haven't done a teach-in here at the Workforce Board in quite a while. Let's get one organized. And from there, things really kind of took on a little bit of life of their own. We got connected with several other speakers and decided to put on this public event, a small but mighty public event. I know that we're joined by several folks online who are watching remotely. But again, I want to thank everybody for coming, for those who are watching online, for the speakers, and really many people who helped put this event together here at the Workforce Board. I'll name folks at the end, but just know you'll get a chance to say hi to everybody because we're a small crowd. The other thing that prompted us to put on this event is that it's 2022, and it happens to be the 30th anniversary of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, or APALA. And so we have the guy who literally wrote the book about APALA. We have two of the co-founding members of APALA here with us today. So we're really fortunate to have such a dynamic group of folks with us to share their insights, share their reflections, and talk to us about where we're going from here with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the labor movement. And so what we're going to do is actually we'll queue up a video to show, again, 30 years ago, the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. We have a short video of the founding convention, and thanks to the APALA national team for making that video accessible to those of us who work for the state who can't access Google Docs. They, very quickly put this video up on YouTube so we can show it to you all, and then we'll have Kent share a little bit with us. So if we can queue up the video, and we'll show that in just a second. I'm going to mute this microphone.
We have a situation where 40% of all recent immigrants are from Asian Pacific region, and each make a whole CIO for those individuals. A lot of the exploited and farming back and other places for the trade powers go today.
Indication is devastating to personal and full very good. I resent the fact that not only was I considered a second-class citizen, but second-class worker. I was enraged by the fact that my rights as a human being and a worker was disregarded.
It was really good after over a century to finally be here in the House of Labor. Several hundred strong.
On the founding of this founding message,
The convention adopted organizing the unorganized into unions, especially Asian Pacific Americans, as a primary initiative.
It's country. It doesn't matter if you belong to the country. It doesn't matter if you fight the country. It doesn't matter how devoted you are. If you ever get and hands the dues, they will get rid of you. So, I would like to ask all of you here today to answer me this question. Are we going to put our hands down and do whatever the company wants us to do? Are we going to be quiet and let for all of us? Are we going to let them destroy our lives and our family? And not as our lives.
The convention also got civil rights for all workers, including minorities, as a primary goal, and committed itself to end discrimination.
Because you are Indian. I am Indian. The President of the United States comes from immigrant stock. I suppose the police officers, all them, from the case, don't believe that they are of immigrant stock, but they are all immigrant stock. Most of us here came in from Algeria. Some group of immigrants came in America. They were the black Americans. On the side of Chicago, in the picture of the United States. Keep in mind, we are all immigrants. As a result, of all the countries in the world, this country has no group of Christians.
It's not relevant. America has heated Martin Luther King's words that it should judge people on how they wish to be in their Palestinian plans without sharing care. That there is one people and genuine criteria that and frankly, I accept it. I'm proud of my name.
We are making history today.
By Washington District Park to protest police control and shooting. Since the convention, APALA has produced market justice, training a new generation of Asian Pacific American organizers, supporting union organizer campaigns, reaching out to the community, building political power, and fighting discrimination against Asian Pacific Americans in the workplace and in the community.
The first time in history that our very own organization across the labor, Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, single big era for Asian American workers across the country. It was strengthened, they organized, strengthened bridges, getting very labor movement, and this was an agenda, representing interests of all Filipinos.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. And thanks for everybody's patience as we try to figure out the technology. I know those of you who are watching online have had some trouble hearing the video. We will put a link to that YouTube video into the chat and get that out. So apologies for that. We are going to shift gears now, and I want to have, we're going to turn to Ken Wong, who you saw in the video. As I mentioned, Ken is one of the founding members of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. Ken is also the director of the Labor Center at UCLA and the author of Asian American Workers Rising. And I've had the great pleasure of working with Ken over the last several months on a project around the freight sector. And so I'm really glad that Ken, you made time to join us remotely from LA. We're really grateful to be here with us. So I'm going to let Ken take it away, and what we're going to try to do is have a little bit of Q&A afterwards. And Vladimir, if you could just turn up the sound a little bit. Because folks are having a little bit of trouble hearing the sound on the video. They may have the same issue with Ken on Zoom. So if you wouldn't mind turning it up for the Zoom in just a second. And with that, I think Ken, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much, Shrayas. Can you hear me on the audio okay? So I first wanted to thank Shrayas not only for his leadership at the California Workforce Development Board, but also for helping to organize this event in Sacramento. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you in person, but I am absolutely delighted to be presenting to you this afternoon. As Shrayas indicated, this month marks the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And I have fond memories in reviewing that 30-year-old video of all of the people that came together 30 years ago to launch APALA. And I was born and raised in Los Angeles. And so here during our founding convention, I was watching the media coverage following the police acquittal of the police involved in the beating of Rodney King, and watching my hometown, watching the city of Los Angeles erupt in flames. And so even at the founding convention, we changed our agenda to march on the US Justice Department. And this was quite a sight. We had 500 Asian American labor activists marching down the street in DC. This is not a common occurrence. And when the media came up and asked, well, why are you here? Why are you marching? Why are you protesting at the US Justice Department? We responded, we are marching for justice for Rodney King. That's not what they expected to hear from us. But from our very inception, we understood that in order to advance the rights of Asian and Pacific Island workers, we have to advance the rights of workers of all colors. And indeed, an injury to one is an injury to all. So I wanted to share with you a brief PowerPoint that I put together for today's event. And I hope you can see this. Does that look okay? So I will quickly go by this PowerPoint presentation, but essentially the history of Asians in America is a 170-year history. And it is largely a working class history. Chinese were the first wave of immigrants from Asia, beginning with the California Gold Rush back in 1849. Chinese planted the first crops in the Central Valley of California and worked to develop the fishing and cannery industries on the California coast. Chinese worked in the emerging cities of California and worked in laundry, garment, restaurants, and other low-wage, labor-intensive jobs. Many of these jobs extended for generations, and to this day, you see the remnants of the job segregation of Asian workers from the very early days. Many Chinese workers were forced to take jobs that were considered women's work, work in laundries, work in restaurants, work in garment factories that other workers found undesirable. Chinese workers were the first to build the Transcontinental Railroad linking California to the eastern United States. And the Chinese railroad strike that was documented all the way back in 1867 was one of the very first examples of Chinese workers standing together, organizing and fighting back. And they were fighting around pay equity because the Irish workers who were building the Transcontinental Railroad from the east to the west were making more than the Chinese workers. It took until the Obama administration, until they were the extraordinary work of the Chinese workers who built the railroad were recognized by the US Department of Labor. This is a racist cartoon that epitomized the anti-Chinese movement, and you have a racist caricature of a Chinese worker on the left, at the same time sewing clothes, doing hand laundry, working in the construction trades, working as shoemakers, rolling cigars. And the image on the right is a group of unemployed white workers, and the caption reads, "What shall we do with our boys?" So this was the racist imagery, the racist narrative that was promoted back in the 19th century. And you see many of these same racist images, as well as some of the same racist messaging that have continued to this day. This anti-Chinese movement led to the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first immigration law in US history to exclude a group based on their race and national origin. This was a victory for the anti-Chinese movement that swept the nation. It banned large-scale migration from China for generations and denied citizenship rights to Chinese immigrants. It later was extended to include Japanese, Filipinos, and other Asians in later years. Tragically, Samuel Garpers, the founding president of the American Federation of Labor, was a major champion of the Chinese Exclusion Act and also moved to bar Chinese and other Asian workers from joining US unions. The next group of workers from Asia were the Japanese. The first wave of Japanese American workers were known as the Issei, or first generation. Their children were known as the Nisei, and their grandchildren, the Sansei. Japanese workers came in large numbers in the 1880s following the Chinese Exclusion Act and worked extensively in the agricultural sector. Anti-Asian immigration policies extended to Japanese with the Immigration Act of 1924. And so you have the wave of Japanese migrants that began following the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that was effectively curtailed in 1924. Here's an image of Japanese American farm workers. The Japanese American concentration camps of 1942 to 1945 were passed by Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt. This was one of the most egregious civil rights violations in US history and resulted in 110,000 Japanese Americans shipped to concentration camps. The third wave of immigrants from Asia were Filipinos. First generation of Filipino workers came in the 1920s and 1930s, known as the Manong, or brother, in the Ilocano dialect of the Philippines. Anti-Asian immigration policies did not apply because the Philippines was a colony or a protectorate of the United States. Filipino workers also worked in agriculture as low-wage workers in emerging cities. And with the passage of the 1934 Tidings-McDuffie Act that granted independence to the Philippines, so too did the anti-immigration policies extend to Filipino workers. So the Filipino farm workers actually began organizing all the way back in the 1920s and 30s, but very few people know that in 1959, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, comprised primarily of Filipino workers, including Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong, along with Dolores Huerta. It was Filipino workers who were the first to launch the historic Delano grape strike in 1965, which lasted 5 years and led to the launch of the United Farm Workers of America. So it was a Filipino farm labor organization and a Mexican-American farm labor organization that led to the establishment of the United Farm Workers. This is an image of the Filipino Hall in Delano, which was headquarters for the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And here is a mural that exists to this day in the historic Filipino community of Los Angeles with an image of Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong, two fierce Filipino labor leaders who organized in the fields of California. The Immigration Act of 1965 lifted anti-Asian immigration policies that had been in existence for more than 80 years, and it led to the largest migration of Asians in US history. I remind people that this was the direct result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so the very existence of Asians in America is directly linked to the African-American-led civil rights movement, which struck down Jim Crow and other segregation laws and other blatantly discriminatory laws, including immigration laws in the country. Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic community in the US, numbering 22 million in 22. Los Angeles and right here in California, we have the largest Korean American community outside of Korea. There are now more than 1.8 million Korean Americans. Once again, this was the result of the change in immigration policy. In 1965, Korean American workers are concentrated in healthcare, education, government, and service jobs. There's a recent excellent documentary that was just released on the first national campaign led by Korean Americans to free Cho-Soo Lee, a man who was unjustly convicted and was on death row. Cho-Soo Lee went on to become a union organizer with the Service Employees International Union. The end of the Vietnam War in 1975 also led to a huge mass migration of Southeast Asian workers. More than 3 million people fled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia between 1975 and 1995. More than 1 million South Asian refugees were resettled in the US. Many of the resettlement programs involved finding Southeast Asian workers jobs in industries, including meatpacking, electronics, education, healthcare, home care, farm labor, and fishing. The largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam is in Orange County, and low-wage jobs and high rates of poverty are prevalent, especially among Laotian and Cambodian workers. The UCLA Labor Center just conducted a study on Vietnamese nail salon workers that talked about the massive dislocation that they suffered during the pandemic. Immigrants from India began coming to the US in the 19th century and mainly worked in farm labor. Following the 65 Immigration Act, temporary visas for high-skilled workers, employment-based immigration for educated workers, and large numbers of college students resulted in a massive growth of migration from South Asia. Indian Americans are concentrated in healthcare, tech industries, government, education, and the service sector. And from the 40 years, 1980 to 2019, the Indian immigrant population increased 13-fold. And as of 2019, there were about 2.7 million Asian immigrants in the US, making them the second immigrant group in the country after Mexicans. There's been exciting organizing among South Asian taxi workers. Baravi Desai, the leader of the Taxi Workers Alliance pictured in this press conference, is the only Asian American who currently serves on the AFL-CIO Executive Council. There are about 1.4 million Pacific Islander Americans. The largest groups are Native Hawaiians, Samoans, Chamorros, Fijians, Paluans, Tongans, and Tahitians. American Samoa, Guam, and North Mariana Islanders are US territories, unlike Hawaii, which gained statehood in 1959. And following the Immigration Act of 1965, thousands of Pacific Islanders migrated to the US. Pacific Islander workers are concentrated in tourism, agriculture, government, and service sector jobs. And here's an image of a march to protect Hawaiian lands that was staged in Hawaii. So the establishment of APALA 30 years ago this month really opened up a new chapter within Asian American labor history. The image you see to the right is the historic march and strike of Chinatown garment workers. And they were very much an inspiration of many of us to build the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And for the past 30 years, we have forged labor and community partnerships. We have organized the unorganized. We have helped to recruit a new generation of Asian American union organizers throughout the country. And we have been particularly involved in the fight for immigrant rights, to provide pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants, to promote labor and community alliances for economic and racial justice, to strengthen global solidarity in the Pacific Rim, and especially of recent, we've been doing a lot of work to oppose anti-Asian violence and to build multiracial unity. So in conclusion, the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is largely a working class history. We've been an integral part of the US workforce for 170 years. Our workforce is diverse and complex and found in almost every city, state, and workplace in the country. Problems of discrimination, economic disparities, low wages, and lack of advancement opportunities are still common among Asian American and Pacific Island workers. And the labor movement has been and continues to be an essential organization to advance the rights of AAPI workers and all workers. This is a copy of the book that I recently published with many other APALA leaders, featuring a 30-year span of extraordinary APALA activists and leaders who have helped to build this organization over the years. The cover image was taken back in 1994 at the APALA convention. John DeLauro to the left was my former student at UCLA, who went on to become the national president of APALA. Sujin Lee in the middle is still working with the APALA National Office on strategic planning. And Jennifer Sung on the right was just confirmed as the first Asian woman on the Ninth Circuit District Court appointed by President Biden. But all three of them got their starts as union organizers through the work of the APALA Organizing Institute. We are currently involved in a campaign to stop anti-Asian hate, and this includes both promoting political mobilization to stop the voter suppression, which is so rampant throughout the country, to advance immigration reform, and to forge multiracial unity to oppose racism and hate. And the tragedy in Buffalo, New York is an example that we must stand in solidarity with other communities of color, and that the attacks on AAPIs not only has a long history in this country, but it is directly related to racism and white supremacy. And this very summer, we have a whole series of exciting events. The event today in Sacramento is one of many across the country to mark the 30th anniversary of the founding of APALA. On June 24th, we're having a racial justice hearing at the AFL-CIO headquarters, and we will have a 30th anniversary celebration concluding with that afternoon. On June 25th, there will be a march and rally in DC for racial justice led by the API community. We have a Dream Summer 2022, and we have a special API cohort to work with APALA. On August 27th and 28th, the National APALA Executive Board will be participating in an immigrant rights border tour in San Diego, and we will all be working this fall to do extensive voter mobilization. So that concludes my presentation. I hope that the audio and video quality was okay. I know that these are always challenging to share across time and space, but thank you so much for including me today.
Thank you so much, Kent. Do we have anybody who has a question for Kent? We can try to. We're going to try to communicate with you through the Zoom if possible, and I can come around with the microphone if anybody wants to ask a question or a comment.
Hi, Ken. This is our Women person. I would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I hope that anyone who's interested in the Asian Pacific Islander labor movement will join you and join us in APALA, Sacramento Chapter. So please feel free to come over and ask questions. I also have the book that Ken mentioned with me if you like to take a look while I get a copy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oranit, and thank you for helping to organize today's event.
Hi, Ken. Susan Minato. I just wanted to make a comment to the audience that because of Ken's work and the publishing of so many books, that he has really exposed, a lot of the underlying, work that is being done in the country currently that goes upward to the invisible. And so maybe Ken, you could say a couple of the other titles of books that are so critical that you've put forward, especially to the center.
Thank you so much, my good friend Susan Minato, who actually just spoke at my class on nonviolence with Reverend James Lawson at UCLA a few weeks ago. And I'm so glad that Susan will be part of the panel this afternoon. She is not only one of the few Asian Women Union presidents in the country, she has done extraordinary work to advance voter mobilization and help to flip the states of Arizona and Georgia. So Susan Minato represents the finest APALA organizers in the country today. But thank you for the shout out. We do have a whole series of publications that are very much to support movement building. And our latest two books are the one that we are promoting today, Asian American Workers Rising. We have a new book called Revolutionary Nonviolence with featuring the teachings of Reverend James Lawson Jr. The building you see behind me is now known as the UCLA James Lawson Jr. Worker Justice Center, based on an appropriation from the California State Legislature spearheaded by our good friend, Senator Maria Elena Durazo. And so because of that generous appropriation, we now have a permanent home for the UCLA Labor Center within walking distance of 20 major unions of Los Angeles. So this is what worker power can build. We have many publications. Check out our UCLA Labor Center webpage. We put out a book on Mike Garcia, the legendary leader of the Justice for Janitors Union. We put out books on the undocumented immigrant youth movement, and we're working on a current publication on art and activism of the immigrant youth movement.
Excellent. Anybody else? Anyone? And sorry to those who are watching remotely that we don't have it dialed in enough to be able to allow that kind of questions and answers. Oh.
Hi, Ken. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got involved in the work, and also personally, what keeps you going.
Could you repeat that question? I'm sorry, the sound quality wasn't very good.
It was how you got involved in the work and what keeps you going.
Great. So I'm a product of the public schools of Los Angeles. The first picket line I ever walked was with my teachers, who are members of the United Teachers of Los Angeles. So that when they launched a 6-day strike back in 2019, and shook up the city of Los Angeles and mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to support them, I reflected on my experience when I was in middle school and walked a picket line with my teachers of the UTLA. My first involvement as an organizer was as a boycott organizer for the United Farm Workers of America. And I was inspired by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and Philip Veracruz. And it was through my involvement with the farm workers that I learned about the long history of Filipino farm worker organizing that I had never known about. They didn't teach me about that in the public schools. And I went on to become a union attorney for the Service Employees International Union. And for many years, I've been the director of the UCLA Labor Center. And so what keeps me going is to work with the extraordinary people like Shrayas, like Susan, like Oranit, like Janice, the people who make APALA such an extraordinary organization. It is multi-ethnic, it is multi-generational, it is multi-union, and it reaches into every city, every workplace across the country. And yet we still have a long way to go, because although there are more than 22 million Asian and Pacific Islanders living in the United States, we are not as active in unions and within the labor movement as we need to be. And especially now with the rise in anti-Asian hate, this is a time when we need to build power, we need to organize, we need to push for voting rights and to mobilize our communities to vote. We need to fight for immigration reform, and we need to push back on white supremacy and racism.
One more question, Ken.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm an Asian American Studies student at UCLA. And I came on a senior basis on labor unions in the 90s in that area. And my question is kind of more specific than everyone else's, but I was just curious. I read a lot, I guess, about the 1982 Chinese strike. And I was wondering, because I read a lot of the strike itself, but I'm more curious on the effects. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe if that strike kind of transformed the relationship that Asian Americans have with the union, or if you just talk a little bit more about the effects. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Well, always great to hear from other Asian American Studies students. I've been teaching Asian American Studies for many years at UCLA, and my class on Asian Americans and the law has recruited a lot of people who have gone into public interest law. But the history of Asian workers within the garment industry dates back over 150 years. And throughout many, many generations, we have witnessed outrageous exploitation and abuse among workers in the garment industry. One of the worst examples was in 1995, when a group of 74 Thai immigrant workers were freed from slavery. And when they were freed, the immigration authorities immediately proceeded to deport them and wanted to send them back to Thailand. And it was through a labor community coalition that we pushed back and we said, what message are you sending if workers challenge the slave shop and sweatshop conditions that the response is the government deports them? And so we were able to successfully fight for them to stay. Julie Su became our lead attorney on that case, and she went on to become the California Labor Secretary, but that was her beginning to work on a case to push back on the sweatshop conditions that are rampant within the garment industry. And so that case not only secured a victory for the Thai garment workers in El Monte, but it also set precedential case law and policies that held manufacturers and retailers jointly liable. So on May Day weekend, we had at the building you see behind me, an extraordinary celebration with Julie Su, with Senator Maria Elena Durazo, to celebrate landmark legislation that had been fought for 20 years and that Maria Elena finally covered in the last legislative session, which eliminated piece rate in the garment industry, which has been a major source of the proliferation of sweatshops. Los Angeles is now the sweatshop capital of the country. It's no longer New York City. And unfortunately, there has been a huge curtailment of workers within the garment industry. So many of the leaders of the Chinatown garment workers strike back in 1982 have been laid off, are no longer working in the industry. There still are some, and there still are even more Latina and Asian workers in the garment industry of Los Angeles. But we are still inspired by the organizing that they have taken on over the years. And many APALA leaders and members have been involved in the fight against sweatshop conditions in the garment industry over many generations.
Okay, last round, any other questions, comments? No, I think, Ken, we're gonna let you go. Of course, feel free to stay on the Zoom, hopefully you can hear us and know that we're going to stay with us. Another round of applause for Ken, please.
Thank you for inviting me. Hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you. I really just want to say thank you again so much for taking time to still join us remotely. Really the work that you shared and all the work that you've been doing, and You know, as he said, I felt the same way that I thought I was well read and understood, you know, U.S. labor history, but until I had only found out about APALA for the first time, like a month and a half ago. And so really so much of your work, it's really wonderful to kind of be grounded in the history, the long history of our peoples and struggles. So with that, we're going to transition to a panel of speakers that we've invited to join us here in person. And so we can start having folks come on up for a little chat. First, I'll give a quick introduction, and one of the first questions I'll ask everybody is to say a little bit about their work, so you'll get to meet everybody a little bit more. But first, I'll come on up. I'll grab a seat over here. First, we have Grewal with Food and Commercial Workers. Jassy is the legislative director for UFCW, the Western States Council. Susan Minato, as you heard, one of the another co-founding member of Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. Also co-president of United Care Local 11. Thank you, Susan, and all the folks who were organizing in Arizona to turn that state blue. I might get in trouble for saying that, but that's all right. Also, Susan is on the board chair of the Hospitality Training Academy. If you haven't, look up the Hospitality Training Academy. It is an exemplary program. What each one of your heads up Hospitality Academy. It's a delicious program. I think I have to talk to your students to understand how that makes sense. So hopefully you figure that out. And last but not least, Angelo, Farooq, the board chair of the California Workforce Development Board, a good friend and a champion of the high-road vision for economic and workforce development that we champion at the State Workforce Board and also with the Newsom administration. So, as I said, we just want to start out. I got the mic, but maybe we'll just pass it down. So first, I think, just say a little bit about, who you are, how you identify within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Hi everyone, my name is Susan Minato, and I am the co-president of United Care Local 11, which is a hospitality union that represents about 32,000 members in Southern California and Arizona. And we said earlier, I'm the chair of the board of HTA, and so I get to work really daily with AD, former executive director, and it's so gratifying. Perhaps bridges into some of the work that you guys do day to day, because what it really comes down to is serving for poor people, training them, and helping them into jobs. And so,
anything more you want to say about Enactment?
And then, as we said earlier, we decided that as a union to go beyond just the borders of traditional union. I have grievances, enforcement contract, and even do, militant work like strikes and stuff like that, just because our members were so weak that they can't pay their rents, they can't get to work, they have to live far and far away from towns. And so we decided to branch out and really get so hugely involved in politics. That's why we ended up doing the Arizona General Race President, as well as U.S. Senate and town ballot races. And then we picked up to Georgia because we're like, okay, well, I didn't want, but the Senate seat balance. So that's why we called Stacey Abrams and asked her, she wanted our help. So she was very gracious and said, please help. And so she put us in a bunch of areas outside of Atlanta. And it was wonderful, and it made the members feel like participating in federal, national politics, make a big difference. And so that was really amazing, but we also worked really daily on cities and local politics, county politics, state politics, and so we're really deeply involved in that. And as I make reference, to Reverend James Lawson, I mean, he has been a major influence of us. He was the architect of the online direct action part of the civil rights movement with King. And so he is 93 years old and has been mentoring us for about 30 years. And so we have pushed ourselves to really go beyond the regular.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jassy Grewal. I am the Legislative Director with the United Union Commercial Workers Western States Council. UFCW represents workers, particularly in the food sector, so we represent all workers in the food supply chain, farm workers, food processing, meat packing, poultry processing, cold storage, warehousing, grocery stores, grocery delivery. We really run the gamut of the entire food sector. We also represent other private sector industries like cannabis, pharmacy and pharmacy technician workers, healthcare workers, dental workers, Cs, Ds, all sorts of industries, mainly in the private sector. Our workers are mainly people of color and women, and our workers are working class people and have a good union job that can support their families, put food on the table, and be able to pay rent. The Western States Council, who I work for, we're in the legislative and political arm, so I work on our legislative priorities for California, for Nevada, and for Arizona. Mainly do California law, so don't do too much in the areas of the all of their legislative agendas, as well as doing political work across our state, as well as Nevada and Arizona. We were part of a group that helped flip Nevada in 2018. What was an amazing success, and looking forward to seeing more of what we can do this year for the working class people of Nevada. So that is some of the work I do, and I'll go into the policy specifics. But as it relates to how I identify, I think I wanted to touch on this subject because I am one of very few Indian Americans who works in politics, especially in the labor movement. And it's important to talk about how we identify because my lived experiences really inform my professional work as it relates to the issues I work on for the working class. My dad migrated here from India and migrated to Canada when he was 17 years old and decided that he actually wanted to come to America because there's more opportunities. But he didn't really want to bring his family patient and didn't want to wait for the process to play out. So he actually illegally crossed the border to America and started off his career as a farm worker in Fresno. He was undocumented, lived on the farm, with him and his two friends that he came here with from the village back home in India. So that is my roots of where I started from. My mom later came over. She had a RN in India that did not translate here, so she's been LPN with me in a skilled nursing facility since she first came here, same facility that she started out with. And so that is my parents and their journey as working class people. And then I think my life is really defined when we talk about Asian American violence by the 9/11 attacks. That was really instrumental in defining my experiences growing up as an Asian American. I was in third grade, really trying to grapple with what does this all mean. I lived with my grandparents who dressed in the traditional Indian garb. My grandpa wears a turban, so that I think was the defining moment of my life when it came to my identity and what it means to be Asian American in America. Also, I did speak English while I was born, and I was born here because speaking the dialect in your parents' mother tongue is really important in our community. So I take all of that as my lived experiences really define the work that I do and the policies that I work on. And I just wanted to just briefly touch on this before we move on. We're here for AAPI, and I often hear the word my subcontinent of India in the acronyms that we use. And so I think it's really important to share that I identify as Jassy, which means I'm a country of India. I'm Southeast Asian, and so we're not a monolith. There's a lot of folks who identify as Asian American, and it's really important to touch upon this, the areas that we come from and how that informs our experience. So very long-winded, but just wanted to be able to share that.
Hi everyone, my name is Angelo Farooq, and as Shrayas mentioned, I'm proud to serve as the chairman of the California Workforce Development Board for the Administration. and work with great people like Tim Reedy, Shrayas, really so really great group of people to work with to have a role in uplifting and empowering workers and small businesses throughout the state, but also I feel like we're not technically part of the labor movement, but I like to think we are. I think we play an important role. We understand the value of the labor movement plays to aligning our shared objectives of making sure families have living wages and benefits and so forth. So it's, in California, just by virtue of our size, it's a pretty substantial system. We have an overall $6 billion system in California. We have over 200 American job centers. These are physical places where people can go, job seekers to get resources as well as small businesses, whether it's on-the-job training or other programs that we have. And in a typical year, over 1.5 million people are served. Again, from a broad workforce standpoint, there's 30 different programs, departments, and so it's not all just workforce innovation opportunities that the federal government goes beyond that. And so, for me personally, I'm probably born and raised in the Inland Empire. I identify as a Pakistani American. Both of my parents immigrated from there. I was born here in Southern California. And so a lot of actually what Jassy was sharing, very similar complementary cultures. I can relate to a lot of that as well. But for me, it was also very personal that my parents divorced when I was very young in elementary school, and my mom, who didn't have any formal educational credentials, worked at the assembly line, raising my two younger sisters and I. She raised me and my two younger sisters living below the poverty line. And so that really shaped my experiences. She actually utilized our public workforce system. And one thing that crystallized to me about the sense of urgency and importance of reforms and advocacy on this effort was that understandably that she started entry-level career opportunity. That's understandable, but it wasn't just a floor for her, it was also a ceiling. There was never any opportunity for her to get training or have any other pathways to get anything else to rely on. Nothing was ever extended to her. And so those are the things that I'm passionate about, seeing the impact that had on family opportunities, being a qualified freelance student and different challenges that go with that. And so I see, that's why I'm proud of, our leadership or our executive director, Randy, started originally with Julie Sue, our Secretary of Labor, before she left the Biden administration, and now Secretary Minato. We just have great leadership at the administrative level, and pushing the Iowa vision under Governor Jassie's vision. So we are very proud in California. We're very intentional about the state funds that we put out. And both of my former distinguished colleagues here have been involved with some of our Iowa training grant investments or respective organizations as evidence of that. And the partnerships, again, with the labor movement, with the unions, have been instrumental in ensuring the job quality component of our Iowa division, worker voice, and the climate resiliency component. All of these things are embedded in our investments and have a big role to play in all of this. So looking forward to this discussion and collaborating together.
Why don't you guys keep that microphone down there? We'll share this one. I'm glad you picked it up, Susan, because I thought I'd ask you, you were there at the founding of APALA 30 years ago. Tell us about your role in the founding of APALA, or maybe you have some interesting funny stories or maybe some horror stories you want to share that you, for some reason, want to live through with us right now.
Well, I would like to say that I didn't really say in the very beginning about how I identify. I'm a fourth generation Japanese American, and my mom was Stray when she was 13. She was retail UFCW. Yeah, and she was so interesting because when I became organized in the union, I said to her, "Oh, how did you make that super difficult decision to go on strike?" And she said, "Oh, well, my coworkers say we're going on strike tomorrow, so okay." And it's like, really? What's so hard for you, you know, because you didn't have pay, you know, all this. She said, "No, you just can't go against your coworkers." Which is like the most perfect thing, so very influential on me to think about, you know, work in that way. And they were in turn, saw how protected, they were in turn, they were 13, 15, not knowing each other, and Manzanar and shipped to Arkansas. And that influence on them, you know, had them, you know, be reticent to, you know, using the cliche words, rock the boat. So, you know, it's very common for them to keep their heads down and, you know, kind of teach us that way. And so I just was, you know, just grateful for that. So that's a major reason for why I came out of this really. Now on APALA, so I started working in the union in the late 80s, in Los Angeles, and Kent, who was still forming the Asian labor alliance in LA, but it hadn't yet an official thing yet. He saw that there was an Asian American woman, you know, in the labor movement. So he's like, grabbed me, you know, and I come to meetings and indoctrinated me. But it was a great thing because it really helped me to understand why it's so difficult to get a job in the movement and why, you know, it seems like it's such a close society, but, you know, you're an activist and they're doing good things, so he's doing a lot of things. And, you know, really, I think our main job is, you know, was to, that was really an interesting aspect of that. The labor movement was a closed society. It was, you know, dominated for many, many years by white men. And then, you know, it started to change somewhat, but in the 90s, it wasn't different, you know, and so it was my job to learn from people who had been fighting the system, like our own internal system, for a long time. And so that's what I did. You know, I was asked to be a national officer as a secretary of the organization, but really the firebrands that you saw speaking were the people I was supposed to learn from. And I really respect that. I think that's a great thing. That's a great thing, a great role to sit and to not say things that you really don't know yet, you know, and to learn. So that was my real role.
Excellent. Well, why don't we shift gears a little bit and talk about, you know, labor struggles, economic justice struggles, particular to Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And I wonder if there are any particular efforts going on or particular struggles or industries that you would like to call attention to. And for you, Angelo, you know, maybe perhaps either the same question or if you want to do that in the context of workforce development more specifically. And tell me if you want to do that.
Sure. Well, you know, I think it's really important that a couple of aspects of this. I think there needs to, the great thing about labor is organizing, right? That's like the lifeblood of labor is. And I think when you look at franchising, empowerment of communities, cultures, that's always the fundamental aspect of the currency, I think, that can drive value and agency. And so I really think for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, API overall, to have a bigger profile and have a stronger reputation, labor has the tools and the framework to make that happen, I think. And so I think to some extent it's interesting because even within the labor movement, as we know, there isn't as much of a representation overall. Obviously, notwithstanding my colleagues here, that it could be in terms of its potential. But I really think, again, even if you look beyond the labor piece, that this could be the engine that propels a broader advocacy. The other thing I would emphasize is intersectionality. So one of my other hats is I'm on the state Planned Parenthood board, chair of the Action Fund for Pacific Southwest. And when we look at what's happening with the leak SCOTUS decision, the impact that has, obviously, there's inherent values of the economy, reproductive justice that, I or sure many of you share those values fundamentally. But if you want to look at it from a workforce and labor lens, it impacts of educational attainment and career mobility opportunities for women, and research has shown, especially for Black women in particular. But again, all of these things end up having an effect on us. So, as Ken was mentioning earlier, an injury to one is an injury to all. It's also, again, if we're looking at this from labor and workforce standpoint, these other issues of social justice, they're all interconnected. And so I think we have to be mindful of these wonderful issues.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, so in hospitality, which is the area that my union was in, it doesn't have actually a lot of Asians in the front of the house and serve positions. So actually, being an HTA, I've been trying to push to have Asians in service, like specifically server type jobs. And because those are actually very well paid jobs in the industry that I work in. And as I mentioned earlier, like all the changes that occurred for Asians coming to the US occurred during the Civil Rights Act of 1964 very heavily. And so I think what Angelo was saying is like absolutely right that injury to one is an injury to all, and then and sometimes that was in detail. So we need to get grants specifically in longer Asian women, for example, and servers. But I would like to offer a really interesting example of what the union, the state government / workforce boards, the employers and the union have all done together. And that is, as I mentioned, we're hospitality. And so in Southern California, LA marketing has done an excellent job. So the All-Star Game, and NCAA Finals, and the FIFA World Cup, and Olympics, they're all in Southern California coming up from now to 2028. We don't have a sector that has cooks, servers, baristas, people like that making very much money. But of course, the Olympics and all those things I just mentioned are bringing billions of dollars to Southern California. So what we're very mindful of right now is that we are unionizing in areas where hospitality does not have a union. We're pushing really hard to have that standard go up. So we recently negotiated a contract with SoFi, which is the rules thing. Where dishwashers by the end of that contract will be making $30 an hour with full family benefits and a pension. HTA did an excellent job of recruiting with the help of numerous community groups of that area, targeting certain zip codes, where they moved about 1,000 people to SoFi. And you all know it's really hard to hire right now. SoFi was super happy with HTA. Okay? And HTA is training arm of the union. So we were getting together in kind of a win-win situation, which is kind of amazing, because usually we're like, fighting the employer, and the employer doesn't think about the training center, all this stuff. So it's really bringing government, employers, the union, and the community all together, and then kind of we're all working together, towards a single goal of really tackling poverty. And that's what we're really talking about. And so it was really exciting for us. And the other thing that, from a union perspective especially, we were also able to win a growth agreement, which means that wherever the contractor at SoFi was in Los Angeles, Arizona, we can walk in a neutral scenario and organize. And so we can spread what happened at SoFi to other places that this contractor has. So it was a really excellent example, and the training center was a big part of that, and as well as government, provide funds, recruitment, and so they can really work together if we were all talking to each other.
I don't know. That was such a good answer. I'm going to focus my answer on a facility that UCLA represents, foster farms. So one of our foster farm plans is over 80% of body workers. Those are workers that are represented by the union. And when it came to the pandemic, we know that poverty doesn't just hit you in wages, but it hits you in the health and safety of your workplace and what you bring back home to your communities, especially when you're a multi-generational family, which is very common in Indian families. You have great-grandparents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, cousins, everyone living under that same roof, which is traditionally done back home in India. And the pandemic really hit our community very hard because of the fact that workers working in non-union, well, we have community facilities and non-union foster farms, were completely devastated by the pandemic. We had employers that refused to reduce line speed, refused to do spacing, refused accommodations to really protect workers, refused to provide masks, sanitation, breaks to wash their hands. And it really hit the community hard because what happens when you come from an immigrant family is you bring your family to the city that you live in and help them get a job where you work. You understand the system of how you apply for that employer, you get them a place to work. And so when you have something like COVID just spread wildly, like wildfire through the facility, that can hurt your whole entire family and have devastating consequences where you might lose an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, all in the same household. And then also living in the same household, you might be spreading that to other parts of the facility when you're coming back home and don't really have the space to be able to quarantine or social distance when you're at home. The union difference in our case is that our facility that had all these Punjabi workers, we didn't have the high rates of deaths or infections or outbreaks as you saw in the non-union facility, which was right across the street, because we were able to provide oversight to make sure that the proper health and safety protections were put in place, workplace protections, labor laws, legal rights were being enforced in those facilities, where across the street you really didn't see the same thing happening. And ultimately, it resulted in the Attorney General having to come in and do an investigation of the facility because cases were just so rampant across the way. And I think just something to know of just the grit of Indian workers is you have Punjabi workers who are really steep. They don't eat meat. They're day in, day out, 12 hours a day, every single day. They're processing poultry. And their gift as a thank you from the companies was poultry, which is not what they consume or eat. And so really it shows how hardworking Indian workers are, but that they're willing to do these conditions because they know this is the highest paid job in the area in which they work in, which is the Central Valley, that doesn't have as many economic opportunities as you might see in more urban areas. So I just wanted to share that piece and how it impacts the multi-generational families also living and working together.
Thank you for sharing that, Jassy. When Jassy shared that we were coming to this event, it was one of those things that's like obvious, but until you live it and experience it, you don't understand what that's like, and then like to the awareness of it. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. I think maybe let's stick with this for a moment, and we at the Workforce Board, we champion a hybrid vision for the economy and for the workforce. Part of that means unions and supporting unions, right? If we don't have unions, we don't have quality jobs. If we don't have quality jobs, our wishes of equity and a more equal society are kind of just that. They're just wishes and hopes. So could you say a little bit about the role of unions and maybe Angelo, for you, like the role of workforce boards in supporting more unions?
Absolutely. So I should have also mentioned that I am an APALA member. So I'm proud of that. And I actually, I'm not active right now, but CFT, AFT, former member, and my wife was at CIU, said she worked with her until she quit to be at home with her 2-year-old daughter. So very proud about my coming from a household they were at home person also. But regarding your question about just our union involvement. Again, you go back to the high trained partnerships, we put our money where our mouth is. Our budgets are a reflection of values, and again, Governor Newsom, our Secretary of Labor, Tim, our leadership, we see the value of partnering with unions, labor movement, again, because we share the same end outcome. And for us, the infrastructure needs to provide also to be able to plug in, especially when we look at the pandemic responses, we have to do some very rapid responses about retraining transferable skill sets from one sector that was having massive displacement of worker, like hospitality would be one example, to other areas like healthcare and grocery workers that were having shortfalls. And so the unions have that infrastructure that are able to help us be able to make those adjustments and strategic investments in these urgent circumstances. So we found that to be very helpful. And I also just think again from the standpoint of rising tides, kind of lifting all boats and around a little bit. So I just think in general, as the standards for workers are lifted more broadly, again, it has the labor group is obviously driving that. So very proud of the program.
I just, it was interesting. So I became the board chair about 4 years ago. And so previous to that, I wasn't nearly as involved in the training center. And when I first started as the board chair, I started trying to understand how to complicated animal. And I was sort of started to see it as the workforce boards appeared to have sort of a whole regular set of people that they funded, and that was really not part of the, really not related that much to the union until the higher training partnership, until I learned of that, and then it appeared that sort of like, high road, it could be beyond, but the high road idea is that the standard is pushed up, which essentially does mean because people are fighting, as I mentioned, so high. And so I think it's a really great innovation. I think Tim and Julie Sue and others, kind of promoted that forward. And so that makes unions be very included in the workforce system, which I think is great. It doesn't mean we supplant other people. That's a really important point, especially in the budget where the state of California is like $100 billion surplus this year, I think something like that. And nobody's supplanted. I mean, we can add individual people money at this point. And so I just think that it's like a perfect time so that everybody can be included. And I can just say from the union perspective, what we do is even though the HDA does the training, and they do the recruitment, and they, of course, push the placements, the union gets involved by going to those employers and having workers, not just, reps and people, but workers go to the employers and say, you know what, you need to hire the trained people from our academy, and they delegate the boss, and they bug the hell out of the boss, so the boss is just like, okay, let me interview these people. That was initially. And then they found that the people came so well trained that now they're banging down the door, like, oh, we need for, we don't care what you're doing, so it's amazing. So we have 100% placement, but it started off a little bit rocky, because we had to push the companies, but we do have that ability to push the companies. And so it's been kind of a great thing. So we'll probably have many employers that have general employers at some point. We could probably, refer you to some employers who would say wonderful things about the higher training program. So,
UCW is pretty new to the workforce development space. We have Sarah Miles, who's our workforce development thinking through what are the career pathways in our industries. Our workers in the grocery stores have worked there for decades. This is maybe the first job that they started in high school, realized they got great benefits, good wages, they can put their families through school, or get their children through school and college, and they stuck with it. And now we're at a point that's pretty pivotal in our industry
where we're gonna lose a lot of our older workers because they're about to retire out. And we have a huge churn at the bottom when it comes to folks that are coming in. Because as a high schooler, we go to the grocery store, you're a bagger, you're trying to get produce, you don't really see, well, where am I gonna be in 5 to 10 years in the food industry? How can I build a career out of this when the status quo and a high schooler person, well, you need to go to college. Well, get a college degree, how is that gonna work in a grocery store? And so we're trying to think through strategically, what are some of the career pathways you can build in the grocery store? Can you become a cake decorator in a grocery store? People go to the grocery stores to get a birthday cake or a cake during the holidays. And so what are the opportunities that we have? And then also thinking through, we represent so many other sectors in so many other industries in the food sector. How do we bridge each part of those industries to be able to build the skills so that workers from our meat packing plants can become meat cutters in our grocery stores? How do we build those connections for our workers to be able to transition? I think where it's most interesting when it comes to unions is in the cannabis industry. I know it's a new emerging industry. We legalized the industry back in 2018. But these are all workers who formerly worked in illicit, they work underground, they work illicitly, they didn't know what the rights are, what are they afforded, what is a union? These workers are the first time that they're hearing, oh, I do have sick leave, I do get overtime, I get disability rights, I have paid family leave, something that they previously weren't entitled to, they're paid in all cash. So you're teaching workers what does it need to have, what are the rights that are afforded in the state and in the country? And then also, how do we talk to you about what the value of a union is and what it means in protecting your rights and further educating you? And so when it comes to our industries, we're still developing those pathways. We haven't established each entrepreneurship, but how do we stand that? How do we grow that? How do we get more workers involved in the pathway of working in the grocery and food sector so they see the longevity of their careers?
You know, when Ken this week, when he was referencing Samuel Garpers, one of the founders of the AFL, who referred to Asians as unassimilable, a new word I heard today, Saturday. Has, you know, that was over 100 years ago. But for Asian American and Pacific Islander workers, is it really that different today? What do you what is it like if you're AAPI and the union? Like, what are the trends or dynamics? Is it something that folks don't feel is for them, that they don't feel included, or and how do we work through that? Thanks for
that's a really good question.
we didn't cover this one. Sorry.
I think it's very interesting. I'm sure the first anecdote for manager membership. So when I talk to my family, they ask me, where do you work? I said, well, I work for UCLA. It's a private sector union. They're like, what is that? And we start to ask questions like, what is a union? And we start to get into, they go, oh, yes, a union came to my workplace 5-10 years ago, and we tried to organize. But culturally, in my culture, you're taught as a woman to not really speak up, to go with the status quo, to go with what folks are saying. So it's difficult to say, yes, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to rebel, and I'm going to speak it out against my employer, who gives me money at the end of every week, at the end of every month to take care of my family. And so when I talk to my family about what it means to be a union, they go, yes, the hospital across the street is unionized and they pay better. They have better wages, they have better benefits, people stay there longer, they're not violating staffing initiatives. So it all comes into this conversation about, we all know that union is different, so what does it mean to actually stand up and fight for your rights in the workplace, especially if you've been there 10, 30, 40 years working in the same workplace. So I just wanted to start with that personal anecdote that sometimes it's difficult culturally to want to stand up, but when you hit this little moment of your life of I deserve better, then you choose to stand up and fight for those better benefits. And to organize. Actually, when my mom tried to organize a union at her nursing facility, the workers got very scared because they were majority Asian women workers who were like, should we stand up and speak out or should we not? And it took a back seat. And they often talk about it because it's the same workforce that works there, but we could have had a different workplace when it came to the pandemic and had a different response when it came to the staff and the patients.
When it comes to our industries, I think it's often a stereotype that Asian Americans are white collar workers, when in fact they are blue collar workers. And so how do you support workers in your industries who are blue collar and are Asian American and their needs are different? We're not a monolith. So every different type of Asian American has different needs. They come from a different cultural background, they speak a different language, and oftentimes we can't communicate together because of all the wide variety of dialects and languages that are spoken. So it's a different type of communication and interaction, and the issues that Asian American workers care about might be different than their white counterparts because they live in multi-generational households, they have a different background, they're immigrants, their children are growing up as first generation, and so it's a wide variety of needs, and so we like to talk to our members about issues, particularly when it comes to political races, of why should you be involved or care, why should we step up and have your voice heard as it relates to that worker-specific needs, and understanding that we're not all a monolith, one issue might not affect the other type of work as well.
Well, you know, is it all organizing? One of the most important things, or probably the most important thing, is to listen. And I think that, you know, generally speaking, I mean, I train event organizers, and that's like the #1 thing to train on. And I think for especially Asians in certain industries, for all industries, I guess, to listen even more. In the context of the union that I work for, the specific local I work for, it is actually dominated by Latinos. And so, but we actually have a decent number of Asians, but we have to get organizers to open their minds as well as listen as well. And I mean, I as a person who, so I have a bunch of, we have all different people that work even in the union. We work with different political leaders, community people around the city and the states, and there just is a stereotype, about it. And so we have to, but on the other hand, I don't want to break a stereotype. I don't want to go out of my way to go out of character either. I want to be myself. And so I think, I train people to be much more open-minded, I would say. And then I think it's, and just you sort of have to deliberately do things. So I think we deliberately chose specific codes. We deliberately push that standard up. We deliberately did lots of recruitment. That's what you have to do. And it's the will of leaders to have to do that. So it's really hard to do. I mean, it really truly is hard to do, but the more people that get involved and the more people like Kent who actually say, you know what, you get up here, you get up panel, and things like that. And then, he's elevated lots of people with books. And so he's kind of like an amazing leader who's extremely humble, and he has done so much more than you ever done. And so that's
I guess there's maybe two things I want to add to that. One is, I think, to Jassy's point about just the diversity of languages and cultures of Asian American. This is why I also think it's really important for the disaggregation of data when we evaluate the needs and demographics and the components of what constitutes Asian Americans. And especially when you disaggregate the data and you see that there's so many groups that are not just in working class, but in serious poverty. And it's very unfortunate because this perception of model minority, there's so many groups that are grouped with that does not constitute that. So I think that is one aspect. The other thing is, I think there's also a disproportionate amount of this, the phrase is referred to as perpetual foreigner. No matter how many generations Asian Americans live in this country, there's always seen by some people as just as being foreign. I mean that kind of in an abstract way, but I'm sure you guys understand and convey so well. And I think that also is a challenge on how, with your question about assimilation and things like that, and how additional barriers culturally and perceptions transcend those circumstances.
I'll mention that, my family came here in the 1880s, and but I still live for Africa. And my husband, who was white, his family came much later than my family. People like that. So it's like, oh, he's an American. She's not. She's like a more recent American. It's like that's really true. This idea. And but again, it doesn't mean that I don't have the same needs, and I couldn't be the same leader and all that stuff. So it really is very good to push yourself in a way to really understand those things.
So I'm going to turn to, talking to sort of the future generations. We have hopefully, I know somebody here who's from UC Davis, is that right? We did put the word out to, all the Asian American studies programs. I'm looking at the cameras, hopefully we are out there tuning in. But, for you all are leaders in your own right, and I think it's, perhaps obvious, but definitely worth mentioning that, it is uncommon to see people of color, Asian Americans in leadership positions that you all are in. And so I'm curious how you would talk to people, what would you say to them to inspire them to get involved, whether it's with labor or, workforce development? What's your elevator pitch to go work for a local workforce for Angelo?
Well, I don't know if it's, I've never actually verified, but somebody told me that there is no other Asian American state workforce board chair in the whole country. And I think that even included Hawaii. I don't know if that's this exact date, that's what I was spoke at National Club Association before. But anyway, my point about that also is like, that's very concerning, right? I think we all need to be very thoughtful about the mentorship to our next generation of leaders, just being very intentional about creating those opportunities. So I think we all need to be mindful of that. I think, and I think from a standpoint of the pitch of why people should get engaged with this, I'll also say, culturally speaking, my mom was very confused why am I getting involved in this career pathway? She wanted, I know it's a stereotype, she wanted me to be a doctor, or an engineer. And so I don't do this as an actual be in the public service, but even then, it's just not seen as like a natural thing culturally. This is, you want to dedicate your time to these issues. But my pitch to people is just that you can generationally change people's lives. I mean, when you break the poverty, the cycle of poverty, it has so many aspects of, we know social determinants from a health standpoint, and we talk about, economic mobility and just the quality of life, so many facets of how it can be transformative for families and cultures and generations. So I think that's a very special thing to be a part of that.
I always say that, that I was so happy that I decided to go into union organizing. I used to be a lawyer. My parents were quite happy that I became a lawyer, and quite sad when I but honestly, like I wake up every day like super excited because I do feel like I'm helping bit by bit to change the world. And one thing I would say though is I think that people have to work really hard to really know what they're talking about. Like we don't need a bunch of people coming in to study it in a book. We need for people to get involved directly, battle it out with working people, battle it out with employers, battle it out with political leaders, and then you learn something, and then you can start putting something together that actually changes the world. So it has been a very gratifying life for me, 30 years in the labor movement, actually a little bit more, but 30 years in this union. And haven't been bored yet. I'm looking for that day, I'm hoping for that day, actually.
So it's an interesting question because growing up, I didn't know, like Angelo, my mom told me to be a doctor or an engineer. Pick one or the other. And it was like, that was the only two careers or a lawyer. For the three careers, and my parents were like, these are the three that we know, come back home, and here are your three options. But there's so much gray area in between of what you can actually do. And I would say I really started to grow my activist roots when I was in high school and realized that there are a lot of inequities in our society that I didn't pinpoint what it was. I just knew I had to do something to change it. But I went to a school where I was one of three Asian or Indian Americans, the other one being my brother, and the other one being my cousin. There was really nobody that looked like me, that was a teacher or could be a mentor or a counselor. And so I started to feel like I have to conform to the situation I'm in order to be able to fit into this norm in these four walls. But then in high school, I really started to rebel outside of it. I was like, this isn't true. And then I was UC Davis, also a Davis graduate, and really discovered who I was and being true to myself. You may not see people who look like you, but you have this inner mission of wanting to do change or bring about change in your community, for your family, or whoever it may be, or the thing that drives you. And just because you don't see people who don't look like you, someone behind you wants to do what you want to do, but might not have the courage to do it. And so you have to build the courage to move forward and put yourself in a position that might be very uncomfortable, but that you know will actually have systemic change in your community. And I think that's really important is that there's always someone who's first, but that you should not be the person who's lost. And mentorship is really important, but also just taking the time to explain to the folks all the different career pathways that they might have outside of the traditional three that your parents in the community might talk about. There are other ways to use your passions, your skills, and move forward and bring your community forward with you.
I used to tell a joke that it's a true story, but I went to India right after graduating high school, and a bunch of family, and their first question was, what branch of engineering do you study? It's the political branch. So, I think we're starting to run low on time, and I know you guys may have to run, so, I think, I'll give you actually an option. You can do closing thoughts if you like, or we can do another round of questions depending on how folks are feeling. Closing thoughts? Yeah. Angelo has to get to the airport as well, so I know we're starting to run low on time, but this has been a really wonderful panel. I'm so glad that you all made it here and took the time to share your own thoughts, your own reflections, your own experiences. So yeah, why don't we just close it out? We can just go down the line and start.
I want to thank Shrayas and I want to thank everybody who pulled this together because these conversations need to happen. And, I know it's Asian American, very strong. That's why some of this time. But the reality is we really need to be Asian reservists throughout the year. And I think a big part of all of this also is to sustain that energy, to organize, to build coalitions, and continue to move the needle on all of this overall. I was going to make one other comment, but for some reason I'm trying to think about it, but I can't exactly remember what I was going to say, but I'm sure Susan and Jassy will.
Well, I like that you set up coalition because, I was honestly surprised when it was sponsored by the California Workforce. I was very surprised. What is doing an Asian American Pacific Heritage Month event, and then here I'm from a union, and so I was really confused, honestly, at the beginning. But then I thought to myself, how amazing that is. you know, because we all do need to be in coalition. It's crazy that we're not in coalition. The workforce work serves the poor, right? It serves the people who need help getting out of their ruts. And then unions do similar things in that we work with people, we organize with people who don't have jobs or have really bad jobs, and we try to get them better standards. And then, you know, community groups who work like dogs, right? They work so hard out there, and they don't have access to some of the good jobs. It's nuts that we're not working together. So I think it's great, and thank you guys for putting this together. I really feel inspired.
Well, one, I just want to say thank you so much for bringing this panel together. I know there's a whole planning committee behind this event too, so thank you for all of those who spent your time to put this together and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Because I hope this inspires other Asian Americans to pursue their dreams, regardless of whether you fit in the status quo or not, and just stay true to yourself and bring in your lived experiences, because good policy comes from lived experiences in which you can identify a big problem and bring about solutions to address that problem. And so I really hope folks who are listening and are here pursue your dreams, however they may be, whether they're culturally or not culturally appropriate, but that kind of passion and systematic change to those around you. So I would just say that, but a huge thank you to everyone who came and everyone who participated.
Do you have some questions for our wonderful speakers? Questions, comments?
Thank you for this panel and like addressing the future, because I'm a third year, I'm kind of well graduate, and I keep telling people I want to work in labor organizing, and they're like, what does that mean? How do you do that? Like, how do people have to do that? I don't know what to talk to. So, you know, I can read, and this is a process that I know is very different. So I was wondering, like, for someone like me, kind of last graduate, I just like got an internship with the Berkeley Labor Center, so it's like little things I know I'm doing whatever. But this is kind of like specific advice, I guess, for that time period and like that entry point. Thank you. Here's my card. Here's my card. Interning at the Berkeley Labor Center is the perfect place. The Berkeley Labor Center, all labor centers are amazing, and being able to do the grassroots, whether it's research, organizing, connecting meetings to government, figuring out how can we all play a role together, and that is the best entry point, I think, other than actually like joining the community. Getting experience and how does it all work and what are all the pieces it takes to actually do the work. We're not all siloed, we rely on each other to make sure our puzzle pieces fit together in order to make the space work. But don't ever be afraid to walk into a union store, talk to a representative, talk to a worker directly, find out what unions are active in your area. How can you join a political campaign? And working on elected candidates to uplift working people in the work that they do in whether it's Sacramento, locally, or nationally. And so I'm happy to give you my card and connect you where you are. That the Berkeley Labor Center really is a wonderful space to be able to see how it all sort of works together.
So first of all, Sarah Marlis has our Garpers. So we're all hiring. But I don't know how much you know. So sometimes I'm going to ask this question, which is like, what in the Jewish faith, like, inspires you to, so like, you know, to be a volunteer or do what you do or social justice? And in Jewish faith, there's an expression to Grewal, which is prepare the world. Right? That's something that we got. And I'm just wondering, in each of your different cultures, is there a saying or something that you look to that inspires you for more people?
I can start. So in Indian culture, there's a role called seva. Seva means selfless service. And so you do service without expecting anything back, and it is the foundation of all of just our culture and the work that we do. And so every single day, I think of that word and how can I do good without expecting anything back? How can I uplift others without expecting anything in return? So same as my word, just in self-service.
Well, for me, my relationship with my culture really is just my relationship with my mom. And so my mom was just very, very big about just the values, ability, and being involved in the community. And so it wasn't necessarily a specific cultural reference to the word, but she just really, she's definitely my foundation of all that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's similar to me, you know, and, we're taught to be decent, you know, and so I think that the world's not decent anymore. Because I really feel that, just being, you know, I credit my parents for helping me to, you know, similar to what you're saying, that, credit them for helping me to understand the difference between good and bad. And so I think you know, feel like the work that's being done in the but also collectively is just really powerful and makes me feel just, you know, really as a whole person, you know, in the world. So nothing that I right?
Anyone else? Any questions? No? All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to the panel for joining us today. And I want to just, two things to close this out, but I do want to say thanks to everybody who, first of all, again, our speakers, Kent as well. Thank you to all of you for coming and those who are watching online. This is the first time the Workforce Board has put on an event like this, but hopefully not the last. Hopefully this is an annual event, and we'll keep growing. I really want to thank a lot of my colleagues who helped put this on. Starting with Curtis Johnson, our Chief Deputy Director. I went to Curtis and I said, I have some huge things. You know, it could have been a small level teaching for just our staff at the Workforce Board, but really, I think Curtis encouraged me to think a little bit bigger, and we were able to find this tremendous new venue. So I really also want to thank the California Natural Resources Agency. I literally called them and said, is this space available? And their response was confirmed. So thank you to them for making this space available. And I also want to thank, unfortunately, with the Sacramento chapter of the Asian Pacific American Alliance had to leave early, so those books that she had are not with us, but if you're interested in getting a copy of Kent's new book, just email me and I'll figure out a way to connect you up. So I want to thank APALA Sacramento for co-sponsoring, and really want to close out with a music video that Ken shared with me. This is a music video that kind of represents sort of this this current generation of AAPIs in the labor movement, and us trying to seek our recognition and being seen. It's a music video called "We Belong," and so let's play that to close out our event tonight. And again, thanks so much for everybody for coming. Awesome, thank you, everybody. I forgot to mention that not only are we a small but mighty audience, the Workforce Board is a small but mighty team, a growing team. If anybody online, if you're looking to find a job, want to get involved in workforce development and change the world, email me. Find us online.